We'll begin with Chapter 5. One of the things we'll be looking at is eyewitness testimony to crime and accidents. So again, I'm your instructor, Mr. Barber. So we'll begin. Initially, the first part we'll look at exoneration. This is an individual, Calvin C. Johnson Jr. If you look at it, the individual was convicted of rape on eyewitness testimony. Primarily, Johnson's defense was, one, the hair that was found was not a match in terms of pubic hair that initially was found at the scene of the crime. In addition to that, 4 witnesses gave Johnson an alibi. But if you notice, the element of eyewitness testimony has a lot of weight. Within that, the eyewitness had implicated Johnson from a photographic lineup. So even though primarily she herself failed to pick him up out of a live lineup, she was still going based on, and again, this is her testimony. So within trial, she claimed that she chose someone else in the live lineup because she couldn't stand to look at Johnson. Primarily within that, DNA proved that Johnson was innocent. Initially, this is another individual, Cornelius Dupree. So if you click on the little portion up here, it'll send you to an initial link. And again, this is the Innocence Project. And it's one of those things where essentially it's a website, but it's also an effort in regards to exonerate individuals who are wrongfully convicted. So Cornelius Dupree initially was accused of robbing a couple and then raping the woman in 1979. So initially he was sentenced to 75 years in prison. At 2 junctures during his incarceration, he was offered parole if he was willing to admit his crime. Now, primarily when you think about that, you're looking at an individual who initially is claiming, yes, I am innocent, but then you have in another incident where you have, or 2 instances where the individual's being given an opportunity in a sense, but it's one of those things where initially within these 2 junctures, they're simply saying, yes, we're willing to offer you parole if you admit to a crime that you yourself feel that, 1, I did not commit, 2, it's a crime that initially I didn't do. Again, he refused parole in 2009 after 30 years in prison. Now, mind you, an individual being in prison for that long, initially you're having different traumas, you're having different elements of not being around family, and you're not seeing all the ups and downs of life. And so you're seeing all these different things, but again, your understanding is that, 1, I am innocent. And for Dupree, initially within that, he's banking on the knowledge that, yes, I am innocent, and I'm not going to admit to a crime that I never committed. So within that, through DNA evidence of the crime, initially he was finally exonerated. When asked why he didn't take the parole, Dupree said, whatever the truth is, you have to stick with it. Initially within this course, you're looking at the element of truth. You're looking at the element of justice. You're looking at all these different elements. And again, within this, you're looking at an individual who's saying, yes, whatever the truth is, I am going to stick with that. Why? Because eventually, hopefully, I am still going to be looked at from the element of truth. And so with this individual, he was finally exonerated. So again, when you look at mistaken eyewitness identification, initially here you have a police lineup, but primarily 75,000 defendants are implicated by eyewitnesses in the U.S. every year. However, some eyewitnesses make mistakes. So herein you have DNA testing. Sometimes it reveals that the person convicted of a crime was not the actual perpetrator. However, recent estimates, 80% of the exoneration for rapes and robberies involve mistaken eyewitness identification. So within that, you're looking at the recent estimates. So 80% of the exonerations for rapes and robberies involve mistaken eyewitness identification. So again, a lot of individuals are being exonerated, yes, but again, it's all based on individuals who had made a mistake in terms of like eyewitness identification. So now, why? And initially, we're always looking at the elements of why. Why is this happening? Why are individuals being mistaken? Again, here is initially one reason. So you have confirmation bias. So primarily, you're looking at that in terms of an eyewitness making an identification, police often stop investigating other leads and instead look for further evidence that implicates the chosen suspect. So initially, they're going to put everything on hold. So if an individual says, yes, this is, I feel like this individual, I saw this individual, I'm not completely 100% sure, but I believe on a stack of Bibles that this individual committed the crime. So now you have police officers who simply put everything on hold and say, all right, we're going to follow this other lead. We're going to look deeper and deeper into the initial elements within this. So this is when the example of confirmation bias takes place. So whereby people look for, interpret, and create information that verifies an existing belief. So again, when you look at examples of the confirmation bias, you have it there, not seeking out objective facts. So objectivity is now becoming more subjective. You have an individual who's not saying, okay, I'm going to delve deeper. I'm going to look farther for more facts. Then they begin to start interpreting information to support their existing beliefs. So again, it's one of those things where if you have racial crimes, you have all these different elements that go into it. But one of the things you start looking at and saying, you know what, maybe there is some kernel of truth within this. And then only remembering details that uphold your belief. So if you're a police officer, you're coming into this case and you've been working cases for 30, 40 plus years, and initially your interpretation of the world is very different from a new individual who's a rookie. Because one, you're going based upon belief systems that you've held for very long, for such a long time. So within that, you're looking and saying, okay, I'm going to uphold these beliefs. And then the fourth one is ignoring information that challenges your beliefs. So again, you have new information, but you've already gone down this initial proverbial rabbit hole of searching out the initial suspect, the possible suspect. Therefore, you're simply steamrolling ahead, and you're not necessarily looking and saying, I'm going to test additional outlooks. I'm simply just going to go with what is already there. I've already invested time, energy, money, and manpower, and so within that, I'm just going to keep going with it, and I'm going to stick with it in the hopes that, one, the eyewitness testimony is accurate. Even if it's not accurate, I am still going to look for information that upholds my initial belief. So now, mistaken eyewitness identification. Only 32 states have laws that compensate the wrongly imprisoned. So now you have individuals who are exonerated. But again, mind you, this is an individual who, at times, if you look at Dupree, if you look at Johnson, initially you have individuals who were incarcerated at a unique time in their lives. And so now, as they were in there, as they were in prison, initially skill sets and all these different things are waning, and their ability to now, when they're finally released, their ability to find a job is going to be a little bit harder. In addition to that, at times they're coming out at a unique point of time where they're a lot older. And so initially within the financial compensation is generally small. In addition to that, social service assistance is rare. Because one, you have an individual who is wrongfully convicted, yes, but initially the aspect of their record has been tainted. And so initially, unfortunately, many exonerees leave prison with next to nothing. So now they're having to rebuild their lives again. They're having to look at their lives and say, okay, what things am I willing to do? What things am I willing to change? How can I rebuild something that initially I lost altogether? All I've been holding on is to this hope that I would be free. Now I'm free. But in addition to being free, now I have to start all over again. Now, mistakes in the process of identification can occur the moment the crime is committed. So now you have situational conditions. So say, for example, darkness. It can diminish memory strength. So now imagine you have an individual walking down a dark alley, or even on the reservation, you have numerous places where there's poor lighting, and some incident of a crime occurs. And I guess the best example I can utilize is our traditional beliefs on Yanadloshis, skinwalkers. Initially, there are different things that we see outside, but because of our fear, our situational conditions, We suddenly look out and we look out into the night, and initially our immediate reaction is, yeah, something's happening. Maybe it's so and so from down the road. I heard that this, and this. And then you imagine that you saw something. Now, mind you, there's a diminished memory strength. So if something were to happen, initially your ability to think clearly, your ability to account for what had happened is going to be diminished because all these different factors are playing into the initial situation. And so within that, your ability to create an actual truthful account is going to be skewed. Now, mistakes can occur during investigations. Police often ask witnesses to examine a series of photos, in other words, a photo spread, or a physical lineup of suspects. Initially, when you have that, mind you, individuals are coming in at a high point in terms of their emotionality. Stress levels are very high. In addition to there's that additional implicit pressure to identify somebody. So now, mind you, and the best way I can look at it is even exam time. During exams, midterms, and finals. So during these times, you have time to complete your exams, and you're given an hour and a half, and you're having to select a number of information. Even the things that you possibly even knew is going to be skewed because one, there's that added pressure. Now, mind you, these are individuals who are being brought in based upon their eyewitness accounts. And there's that implicit pressure to identify somebody. In addition to that, they are likely to assume the perpetrator is in the lineup. So now the individual may think, hey, what if I say something? What if I do something? And the perpetrator's in the lineup? What if I ruin their lives? What if that person tries to get me? What if, and there's all these what ifs. Altogether, when you look at identification, although accurate identifications are more likely than inaccurate identifications, we know that innocent people are sometimes selected, and at times guilty people are sometimes overlooked. So mind you, have individuals who, when you look at it, when you look at the overall big picture, at times innocent people actually get pulled into this element. And I guess the best way I can look at it is wrong place, wrong time. Because a lot of times you have individuals who are getting pulled into these initial criminal aspects, and they had no inkling of what's going on. They had no inkling of what was happening, but initially they were just there at the wrong time. And so that's when they get pulled into these unique circumstances. So now, sketches based on eyewitness recollections. There's an error apparently in my eyewitness. It's supposed to be eyewitness, not eyewitnesses. It is eyewitness. So again, these are sketches. So again, what is the aspect of perception? So again, we're going to look at weapon focus effect. So again, if a person is presented with a weapon, and so initially when a crime is being committed and somebody pulls out a gun or somebody pulls out a knife, what's going to happen is you're going to focus all your energy on the initial weapon. Because one, you're looking at, one, I don't want to die. Two, I want to make sure I get out of this alive. And so initially when that happens, your ability to select and your selective attention is going to be stunted. You're going to only be looking at the weapon. You're going to think, okay, my life's in danger. Within that, my attention capacity is going to be very limited. I'm not going to see the individual's face. In addition to that, the presence of a weapon can also affect the processing of auditory information. Because initially there's that level of deafness. So initially you're looking at saying, okay, I'm not going to process everything. I'm not going to hear everything that's being said. I'm not going to understand what is happening because right at this moment, I am simply focused on the initial weapon. So now, how do we encode a lot of this information? How does our memory play into this? So initially we have stages of memory. So we have the ESR, encoding, storage, and retrieval. So initially you have the memory of the eyewitness in each of these three stages, and they will be described as I go forward, but initially you have it, and so I'll kind of go through these brackets. So stages of memory, so you have the incoming information, the sensory information. So the first one is the encoding. So in other words, information is converted to storage, And then from the storage portion, it goes into the information is retained into memory. And then within memory, it's then sent to retrieval, in which your information is retrieved from the initial memory. So it primarily goes through these three stages. Again, the first portion, encoding. So again, stimuli that are briefly seen or heard cannot be encoded fully. Now imagine that. You think you saw something. You're hypervigilant at this point. You're seeing all these different informational cues going in and out. You hear people screaming, you hear this, this, and this. And at times, your ability, the complexity of a stimulus also affects the encoding process. So extreme stress usually causes the person to encode information incompletely or inaccurately. So mind you, however, how many individuals, when you think about it, how many individuals, when you're retrieving information of a very traumatic incident, and I'll use this as an example, how many have ever driven along on the res, and as you're driving along, and I'll use the first of the month. So this first of the month, so everybody's driving around, everything else very busy. You're running the Chinle, and as you're going in, suddenly there's a high cluster of individuals driving around, and we notice that first of the month is usually like that. It's a lot of traffic. There's a lot of individuals who are excited, everything else. So all these emotions are going on, and you're driving along, and suddenly somebody drives and darts out in front of you. Your immediate reaction is, oh my goodness, slam on the brake so I don't get hit. So in that initial moment, there's extreme stress. If you're with your family, there's additional stressors. If you have individuals screaming in the vehicle, that applies to the additional stressors. You're hoping that your vehicle's brakes and tires are all fully inflated for the tires. You're hoping that your brakes are are still full to the point where your braking power is strong enough to keep you from running into another vehicle. And so all of these things are happening. And so you avoid the incident. So how do you usually replay a lot of the information when you tell your family? So you survive the incident, everything else, everybody's safe, everybody's secure, and later on you're telling, it's the end of the day, you're telling your whole family, you're rehashing everything that had happened. A lot of times the information that we share is going to be a little skewed. A lot of the information will be like, the individual's going at such and such rate, all these different things. And when we replay it, a lot of the information is slightly skewed. Why? Because initially we're going to look at ourselves and we're saying, oh my goodness, this is what happened. I'm going to recollect this. I'm going to recollect that based upon what I encoded. Did I see a red vehicle? Possibly. Did I see a blue vehicle? No. Was it maybe green? I don't know. There's all these different things that go into it because initially you're encoding a lot of the information. So as you move forward, we're now looking at the encoding factor. So the effects of stress are felt more acutely by those higher in anxiety and neuroticism. So initially, we all differ in visual acuity and hearing ability. So here you have the old, do I see a duck or do I see a rabbit? Again, one of the biggest things is our different expectancies about events can influence how they are encoded. So again, if my expectancy is to get something right, is there a higher stress on me? Yes, because initially I'm looking at it from the angle of I need to get this right. Why? If I don't get this right, initially the perpetrator might get away, or initially they're not going to pay for their crime. So all these different influences are influencing our ability to relay the information. We generally have a tendency to see what we expect to see. Initially, that's one of the biggest things we begin to see is our tendency to see something is primarily what we initially, so initially it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. So initially we're looking at the encoding factor. So as we're now looking at storage. Okay, storage. My memory fades as the retention interval increases. So my ability to recollect a lot of the information that I stored is going to be slightly skewed. My post-event information can alter memories of an event. In other words, talking to other witnesses. So if I'm talking to another individual, say for example, if I'm walking into Pizza Edge and suddenly somebody just runs into Pizza Edge, not wearing a mask, and suddenly you see the high stress of everybody running, freaking out, and the individual runs to the pizza edge, grabs all the pizzas, and just runs out. And so when you're talking to the other people that were there, and you're noticing all of this, you're walking towards the store or you're walking towards the pizza edge, and so when that happens, suddenly your recollection is going to change because you see other people there. There's a level of, oh, and there's a camaraderie there. In addition to that camaraderie, you're also saying, and you're talking amongst them saying, did you see that? Did you see that individual? Did you see this, and this? And then our perceptions begin to alter. So now within that, we have the post-event information that conforms to one's beliefs is more likely to be integrated into memory. So my belief system to one's belief, not so much what I believe in terms of religiosity, but more along the element of how the world works. So primarily within that belief system of how the world works, it's primarily going to be integrated within my working memory. So now, storage. Viewing photographs of suspects after witnessing crime can impair an eyewitness' ability to recognize the perpetrator's face in a lineup. So, if I were to view photographs of suspects after witnessing a crime, it may impair my ability to recognize the perpetrator's face in an actual lineup. So again, you're looking at all these different factors that are going into eyewitness testimonies, and you're always asking the question, why? Why is this so inaccurate? Well, because one, our ability to memory or to relay information can be skewed at times. So retrieval. So when we look at retrieval, the wording of questions can influence retrieval. So in other words, if I was a police officer, I was asking all these questions, and I'm asking, what was the man with the white beard doing with the young boy? It may influence memory of the individual that committed the crime. So the unconscious transference, we're always talking about transference in psychology, and one of the biggest things is the victim may pick from a lineup someone they've seen before, but who is not the actual criminal. So initially, the transference that you're applying to an individual is now picked up by that individual, the eyewitness. The eyewitness may begin to alter their initial selection. So positive ID, what does that mean? So Larry Fuller, he served 26 years. So if you have here, so if you click on the picture, Fuller's picture was the only one in both packs. So if you click on this, it'll send you to initially a background of Larry Fuller. So in 1981, a young lady in Dallas was held at knife point, cut and raped. 2 days later, she failed to make an ID. After several days, she came back and picked Larry Fuller out of another pack of photographs. So Fuller's picture was the only one in both packs. So mind you, the first time she selected, she failed to pick him. So the second time, she picked him. Eyewitness testimony is very faulty. One, we begin to realize that yes, it is very faulty. There's a lot of initial areas of fallibility. So now you have the other individual. I don't know if you've ever seen America's Got Talent. And this is Archie Williams, amazing individual, amazing voice. But within that, when Williams sent the letter, he was 12 years old. Initially, he sent his letter to the Innocence Project. So initially, he was 12 years into a life sentence with no possibility of parole for a crime he didn't commit. So for now, for an individual who had been in prison for more than 2 decades, the Innocence Project fought to prove that Williams had been wrongfully convicted of a rape and attempted murder that occurred in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. So now this individual was finally exonerated by fingerprint evidence. So what does that mean? What does that mean for eyewitness testimony? Well, one, we know that eyewitness testimony can have a huge impact on our emotionality. But we also know that one, it is very faulty. So within that, we'll be looking at the uniqueness of a psychologist study. As we study eyewitness identification, one will begin to look at the experimental methodology. So initially, the first one, the researcher manipulates some variables. In other words, the presence or absence of an instruction to participant witnesses, and measures its effects, the likelihood of choosing someone from the lineup. So now the first one is the advantages. The experimenter knows exactly what the witnesses experience, in other words, ground truth, and can also establish cause and effect. The only thing is, the disadvantages and experience they lack ecological validity. So the next one is archival analysis. So initially, this is more of a boots on the ground kind of outlook. Involves after the fact examination of actual cases. So these are individuals. This would primarily be more of an innocence project. So initially, the individual's already been incarcerated, but initially they're looking at and investigating what could have led to mistaken verdicts. Again, it uses real life situations. The only disadvantage is it can only document what happened in those cases, and it cannot explain why. So initially, you're just looking at the process, you're looking at all these different elements, and primarily you're looking at what had led to the mistaken verdicts. And then field studies. That combines the rigorous control of an experiment with the real-world settings of archival analysis. The disadvantages primarily looks at we cannot be certain whether a suspect is guilty or innocent. In addition to that, we cannot distinguish correct identification of the guilty from incorrect identification of the innocent. May have more ecological validity than an experiment. So, initially within that, the variables that affect eyewitness accuracy. So initially, what affects eyewitness accuracy? What things are there that can skew an initial judgment? So initially, Wells, 1978, created a taxonomy to categorize variables. The first one, you have system variables. The second one, you have estimator variables. So the first one, system variables. Again, these are factors under the control of the criminal justice system. In other words, instructions given to eyewitness viewing a lineup. We'll talk about instructions later on, but it's one of those things where these are the factors that initially that are read to the eyewitness. This is what we're looking for. These are the initial instructions in terms of what we need, and the individual may or may not be in the lineup. And it's kind of those elements that kind of help you to better understand what you're going to be viewing. The next one is the estimator variable, factors beyond the control of the justice system and whose impact on the reliability of the eyewitness can only be estimated. In other words, the lighting condition at the time of the crime, the noise level, things that are happening around. All these things cannot be accounted for, but initially those are what are considered the estimator. So now, post-diction variable does not directly affect the reliability of identification, but it is a measurement of some process that correlates with reliability. The confidence that a witness feels for an identification, response latency, and self-reported decision processes. So initially we'll look at those three elements, the confidence, response latency, and self-reported decision processes. So these are post-diction variables. And we'll kind of go and explain that. So I don't know if you guys see the picture. It's a very unique picture, kind of eerie, kind of creepy. But it just keeps you focused. Confidence. An eyewitness's confidence. So again, it's heavily debated, but one of the things is courts have endorsed the idea of reliability of an eyewitness being a reflection of their level of confidence. In other words, an individual saying, yes, that is the individual. I saw them, and I am going to base my whole element of who I am, my whole being, and simply say, yes, that is the individual. And within that, the court initially endorsed the idea. One is response latency. Is the amount of time the eyewitness takes to make an identification. So again, you have an individual who simply says, oh, well, give me a week. Maybe it is the person, maybe it isn't. Again, it's an individual that's simply saying, this is, give me a little bit of time. Because one, I'm not too sure. I'm not 100% sure. I'm kind of 50-50. And within that, you have an individual who is taking their time in terms of making an identification. And again, that can also weigh in terms of eyewitness accountability. The last one, self-reported decision processes. The reported process that the eyewitness uses to make their identification decision. Initially, you're looking at what processes they're using, what belief system are they utilizing within their own lives, in terms of how they structure their lives, not so much their religiosity, but rather their initial upbringing, etc., etc., etc. So initially, they're utilizing all these different things to make an identification decision. So now the race of the eyewitness. So again, eyewitnesses are usually better at recognizing and identifying members of their own race or ethnic group than members of another race. In other words, the other race effect. Racial attitudes do not appear to be related to the other race effect. So now within that, why does the other race effect occur? So again, you have physiognomic variability, in other words, the cognitive interpretation, and you have in-group, out-group differences, in other words, the social interpretation. So we'll kind of we'll go in depth with, well, not so much in depth, we'll kind of glean over the physiognomic variability. So physiognomic variability, again, faces of one race differ from faces of another race in terms of the type of physiognomic variability. White faces show more variability in hair color. Black faces show more variability in skin tone. So initially you're taking into account that. So this is physiognomic variability. For eyewitnesses to correctly identify members of other races, they must focus on the characteristics that distinguish that person from other people of the same race. So white eyewitnesses should look at skin tone when identifying a black person, while a black eyewitness should look at white hair color. So initially looking at the physiognomic, primarily the physical features, the physical elements that make it who they are, and you're primarily distinguishing those elements to initially create a decisional process. So research by Goldinger and Papish, he and Papish monitored eye movement of people as they looked at a series of faces. Initially, the research discovered that subjects fixated more on distinctive features when viewing own race faces than when viewing different race faces. So initially, you're looking at the fixation. Initially, you're being able to say, yes, these are things that I'm noticing based upon my own race, and within that, I am going to delve into it, and I'm going to have a better understanding, and I'll be able to distinguish better based upon my own race. Now you have the in-group, out-group differences. So social psychologists also explain the problem by identifying other race faces through the in-group, out-group phenomenon. So when confronted by someone from our own group, we focus on distinguishing features. When confronted by a person from another group, our initial attention is identifying their group. So we have in-group biases, and then we have out-group biases. So preferential treatment is reserved for those who are considered a part of the in-group. So initially we're looking at distinguishing features for those of our own group, and then when it's from a person from another group, initially we're trying to identify the overall group itself. Now, age and gender of the eyewitness. So when we look at age and gender, we're looking at the element of young to old on both spectrums, male, female, individuals who are gender and sexual minorities, but primarily we're looking at the element of does that play into the ability to make a concrete eyewitness selection. So now the evidence for gender effects is not overwhelming, but tends to indicate an own gender bias, at least for women. So older eyewitnesses and young children make more errors than those who are younger and middle-aged adults. And for those, they are more likely to choose someone from a lineup in which the culprit is absent. So initially they're able to choose someone from a lineup so long as the culprit is absent. So now in recent years, police have begun to incorporate procedures recommended by psychologists and others for interviewing eyewitnesses and constructing and presenting lineups. So in 1998, the U.S. Department of Justice recommended procedures for collecting eyewitness evidence. In other words, these procedures are based on psychological research studies. So if you look at the picture there, a lot of times in our current state, you have individuals who are now utilizing more of their cell phones to initially capture a lot of the criminal things that are happening criminally. In addition to that, you have individuals who are utilizing that as a form of recollection. But prior to 1999, a lot of it, there was no necessary procedure. Again, there was procedures, but initially it was not as structured as things have progressed to now. So initially you have the reforming identification procedures. So a landmark decision by the New Jersey Supreme Court in 2011, State v. Henderson 2011, also issued in a new set of rules for cases involving eyewitness ID. A decision lists more than a dozen factors that judges could consider in evaluating the reliability of an eyewitness identification. In other words, if there was a presence of a gun. So within that, when a defendant presents evidence that a witness's identification may be unreliable, the judge must hold a hearing to consider the issues and must give detailed instruction to the jury about the pitfalls of eyewitness evidence. This decision is expected to have a nationwide impact. So, reforming ID procedures. So, interviewing eyewitnesses. In a standard police interview, one relies on a predetermined set of questions with little opportunity for follow-up. So if there's little opportunity for follow-up, do you think that can also impact a person's ability to share information because of how great our memories are? Pun intended. So here you have cognitive interviews. The interview establishes rapport with the witness, then asks the witness to provide a narrative account of the event, and finally probes for details with specific questions. The interview allows the witness to direct the subject matter and flow of the questioning, interrupts infrequently, and listens actively to the witness's responses. So again, interrupts infrequently. So in other words, the ability to interrupt is limited. So initially, you're looking at the flow of the questioning and listens actively to the witness's responses. So again, they're there, they're engaged, they're learning more. They want to learn more about the initial crime. They want to learn more about what is being proffered, stuff like that. So within that interview, may cue a witness to mentally reconstruct the physical and emotional experiences that existed at the time of the crime. So notice that you're mentally reconstructing the physical and emotional experiences. So you're looking at the stress factors, looking at all these different elements. You're looking at the fear that may have been implemented. You're looking at all the things that the individual is going through. So you're taking all of that into account versus simply just going off of just the facts. You're looking deeper. You're looking at, the initial subjective elements. The interviewer may direct the witness to form an image of the situation, recollect sights, sounds, smells, and physical conditions. In other words, if there was heat, if there was cold, darkness, again, those all play in. If, say, for example, you notice that, yes, it was very dark, there was some level there was humidity, there was this, you're able to now recollect all these different things. You're able to recollect even the smells. One of the things that I always look at when I work with individuals, crimes, we're always looking at the element of things they can recollect, because one of the biggest things you're always looking at is the aspect of emotionality. In other words, the recollection of emotional reactions experienced at the initial time. The witness has mentally reconstructed the event. The interview asks for a detailed narrative and then uses follow-up questions to probe for specific information. So notice that there's a detailed narrative. So the individual is sharing all this information. So now after all that information has been gathered, you're now able to probe even farther. You're looking for more specific information. What other things besides just a red vehicle that was at the scene of a crime or at an accident? What additional things were there? Did you notice this? Did you notice that? Did you notice this, and this? What are the things that you, again, you're not trying to present new information. You're just simply asking for clarification. Don't mistake what I'm saying right now in terms of probing. You're simply utilizing what had already been proffered, and you're just using that as your blueprint to initially gather additional information. Witnesses are sometimes asked to recall events in different temporal order, initially describing the event from the end to the beginning. So again, you have your narrative in front of you, and you're simply having the individuals recount what had happened from a different perspective in terms of recollecting the information from the end to the beginning, rather than starting from A to B, now they're starting from B to A. Initially looking at it from different perspectives. Again, you're always looking at it from the eyewitness's perspective. You're not trying to put yourself in those shoes. You're just simply trying to gather the information. In addition to that, you're looking at it from the point of view of different people. So now the cognitive interview has been shown to generate substantial increases in correct recall, though it can also produce a small increase in incorrect details. Because bear in mind, you're also coming at this, you're interviewing an individual, and they've had time to kind of collect their thoughts. And as they're collecting their thoughts, again, are there times where they're going to be distortions? Yes. But that's one of the things is there is a slight increase in incorrect detailing. So in the lineup instructions, an investigator should instruct the witnesses or the witness that the offender may or may not be present. Without these instructions, witnesses may assume that their task is to pick someone. So they choose the person who looks most like the perpetrator. So that's one of the things you're always looking at is within these lineup instructions, you're trying to be as clear as possible to make sure that that is not their job at this given point in time. In traditional lineup, all lineup members are shown to witness at once. In other words, a simultaneous presentation. The alternative is now what's considered a sequential presentation. In other words, the witness makes a decision about each lineup member before seeing the next. So they're given that time. They're given that time to look at, okay, let me think about it, then move on to the next individual. Here's one, live police lineups. How do they work? So you have the blind administrator, and then you have the non-blind. So you have the simultaneous lineup, and then you have, they're both simultaneous. So initially you have the blind administrator, and then projects over here. And then you have the sequential lineup. Witness views lineup members one at a time. Again, there's difference in terms of does know the suspect identity and then knows suspect identity. One does not know the suspect identity, and the other knows suspect identity. So the manner in which a lineup is presented can affect the accuracy of identification. In general, sequential lineups result in fewer identification attempts, so both mistaken and accurate identifications are reduced. So within that, you have lineup presentation methods. Why are there more mistaken IDs in a simultaneous lineup? So within that, in the simultaneous lineup presentation, eyewitnesses tend to identify the person who looks most like the culprit relative to other members of the group. In other words, a relative judgment. As long as the perpetrator is in the lineup, the relative judgment process works pretty well. Again, one of the things you're looking at is, so now the question is, but if the actual culprit is not shown, a positive ID may still occur because someone in the group will always look most like the culprit. In a sequential lineup, the eyewitness compares each member in turn to his or her memory of the perpetrator, and on that basis decides whether any person in the lineup is the individual who committed the crime. In other words, an absolute judgment. So now the influence of feedback. One, you're looking at the lineup. It's typically conducted by the detective who selected the fillers and knows which person is the suspect. A lineup administrator's knowledge of the suspect's identity can increase the likelihood that an eyewitness will choose someone. More likely, when the administrator has failed to provide instruction, that suspect may not be in the lineup. So here you have the initial table, rates of choosing lineup members when a culprit number 3 is present versus remove without replacement. So culprit present, 54%. Culprit remove without replacement. Initially the possibility of lineup member 2, therefore that goes into the relative judgment that was kind of expounded upon earlier. So initially you have the 12% after the lineup 4. So if you notice, there's kind of that element that kind of goes into it. Then you have the no choice. Now, ideally, the lineup should be administered by someone who does not know which person is the suspect. I would sometimes express increased certainty in their ID as a result of events that happen after they choose someone from the lineup. In other words, if eyewitness received confirming feedback from the lineup administrator. Confidence expressed by eyewitnesses is one of the most compelling reasons why jurors believe such identifications are accurate. So again, you're looking at the confidence. The individual expressing that, yes, I did see this. From the bottom of my gut, I feel this is the individual. I know this is the individual, and therefore that is the reason why jurors believe identifications are initially accurate. So now, reforming identification procedure 16 of 17. So eyewitness confidence. So a question that has vexed psychologists for many years is whether there is an association between witnesses' confidence and their accuracy. So within that, the answer depends on several things. In other words, whether the confidence in the identification expressed in the courtroom or at the police station, and whether procedures used to obtain an identification were free from bias. So, whether a witness's statements of confidence in the lineup are indicative of accuracy depends on how that identification was secured and reported. You want to make sure that it is free of bias. You want to make sure that it is not influenced or coerced. You want to make sure that the elements are clear. You want to make sure that the suspect does not stand out from the fillers. In other words, if you have an individual who has a beard and the rest of the individuals don't have a beard, is that individual going to be selected? Obviously, because again, those are the things that are standing out. The lineup administrator provides unbiased instruction and avoids giving post-identification feedback. In addition, confidence is measured precisely and immediately after an identification. So, studies have shown that witness confidence is not a very good predictor of a witness's accuracy unless it is measured immediately after an identification. In other words, asking witnesses to provide a statement of their degree of certainty before giving them any feedback can be an effective way to eliminate the problem of false confidence. So, within that, jurors put a great deal of weight on testimony from an eyewitness. So, Loftus, 1974, gave subjects a description of an armed robbery resulting in 2 deaths. Within that, 80% of those presented with only circumstantial evidence against the defendant convicted him. 72% convicted when an eyewitness ID was presented. Now, jurors have a baseline expectation that eyewitnesses are accurate. So why do jurors overestimate accuracy? So initially, jurors assume that eyewitness testimony is a reflection of their memory quality and not the way they were questioned or interacted with the lineup administrator, fundamental attribution error. So in other words, jurors overly rely on an eyewitness confidence when gauging accuracy. In addition to that, jurors could be informed about whether investigators follow Department of Justice guidelines for conducting lineups. I believe the next slide will have a link to the Department of Justice guidelines. Within that, you have the eyewitness testimony, which could be limited. Allow psychologists who are knowledgeable about the research on perception and memory to testify, in other words, an expert witness. So here it is. Here's a download for eyewitness photo arrays. So here's, you click on that, it'll bring you to an initial memo that was sent back in 2017, U.S. Department of Justice, and it kind of lays out what is needed in terms of the procedures for conducting photo arrays. So now, judges could instruct juries about the potential weakness of eyewitness IDs and suggest how to interpret this testimony. Judges could limit eyewitness testimony. For example, a judge could rule that due to the particular eyewitness conditions in a case, portions or all the eyewitness testimony will not be admissible. In other words, now we're going to look at expert testimony. The testimony focuses on factors that influence eyewitness accuracy. Such testimonies might indicate that extreme stress tends to inhibit encoding. Feedback from a lineup administrator can increase an eyewitness's confidence. Differences in the way lineups are constructed and presented to witnesses affect eyewitness accuracy. So, initially, the expert's task. One is to provide the jury with a scientifically based frame of reference within which to evaluate the eyewitness's evidence. It does not tell the jury what to believe about a particular eyewitness or whether the eyewitness is accurate. Initially, they're primarily offering an unbiased, scientifically based reference point. The expert testimony tends to sensitize jurors to problems in witnessing and identification procedures. So, in other words, they're initially helping the jurors understand that there are going to be issues in terms of witnessing and ID procedures that are implemented. So initially, they're just laying down the groundwork that one, at times there are fallacies. There are things that can happen, encoding, storage, memory retrieval, stuff like that. So here's one expert testimony. In 1976, the wealthy Hannigans caught 3 illegal Mexican aliens on their property, tortured them, and then chased them back across the border. Again, tried in the same court, brothers Thomas and Patrick Hannigan were given simultaneous trials. Thomas was allowed an expert witness. Patrick was convicted, and Thomas was acquitted. If you notice, the expert witness was one that kind of played into that. One in terms of what was proffered. Again, we can see the initial weight that an expert testimony can provide. So now, what is jury instructions? Because I've been talking about that for a while, and it's one of those things where I need to kind of clarify. So the defense sometimes requests that juries be alerted to the limitations of eyewitnesses. The judge decides whether to grant the requests. So initially, what effects do cautionary instructions have on jurors' beliefs about eyewitness accuracy? So now the tell-fair instruction. Reduce mock jurors' sensitivity to eyewitness evidence, probably because that instruction gives little indication how jurors should evaluate the evidence. So if you click on here, it'll take you to the tell-fair instructions. These findings provide some hint about the type of jury instruction that could reduce the likelihood of mistaken convictions in eyewitness cases. Those instructions, as yet untested, are likely to be issue-specific, tailored to the facts present in a particular case and based on scientific research findings. So now we're going to look at children in terms of their ability to recollect information within the element of eyewitness testimonies. So children over the age of 6 can make reasonably reliable identifications from lineups, provided the perpetrator is actually in the lineup and the child had extended contact with the perpetrator. So again, this is one of those things where they have an element of familiarity with the perpetrator. In addition to that, they're able to actually provide a lineup, or they're able to identify the individual from the lineup. Children are generally less accurate than adults when making an identification from a lineup in which the suspect is absent. In other words, they pick someone else. In other words, making a false positive error. Now, possible solutions. Giving children the option to say not sure. Because initially what we're always looking at is from the element of adults, we're always looking at in terms of always making sure that our ability to relay information is from an adult perspective. But if you're looking at it from a child's perspective, you're trying to make sure that the individual has that element of safety and security. In addition to that, you want to make sure that they're being heard. Initially within that, the instructions informing them of the importance of making the correct decision, decrease guessing, and the incidence of false identification. Now, CSA, child sexual abuse cases rest solely on the words of the victim because these cases typically lack physical evidence. Initially within that, there are concerns about whether children can be trusted to provide accurate details and disclose experiences of abuse. So the first part, investigative interviews. First, building rapport. So building rapport, what does that mean? We're always talking about building rapport within therapy. We're always talking about building rapport in counseling. Within psychology, we're always trying to build rapport. So again, how do we do that? One, we build rapport by initially ensuring that the young individual, the child, is being heard. but also talking about the commonality of things, whether it be about the favorite shirt they're wearing or talking about their favorite playtime activity, stuff like that. Then encouraging the child to then expound and provide details in their own words about the initial element that we're initially starting to look into. After this, investigators may ask specific questions about the event. Although children are less accurate with specific questions, the structured protocol discourages the use of suggestive questions. In other words, he touched you, didn't he? One of the biggest things you're discouraging the use of suggestive questions, because initially you're almost leading the child to initially expound on what you want them to say. And primarily that's what you're concerned about. You want to make sure that you're not leading the child into information. You want to make sure that you're not creating a bias. Naturally, within that, children are less accurate with specific versus general questions because, one, specific questions ask for memories of events that the child may never have encoded or may have forgotten. Number two, the child may answer a question that she or he does not fully understand in order to be cooperative. Again, you have children who initially are trying to please the initial adult, and so they're initially going by whatever the adult is providing. Number three, specific questions can easily become suggestive. In other words, you're leading the child. You're, in essence, not coercing, but you're initially encoding new information, which then the child may initially incorporate into their own accounts. So within that, a sizable number of children experience multiple incidences of sexual abuse. Repeated events enhance memory for aspects of the incident that are held constant, but impair the ability to recall details that vary. Prosecutors must provide evidence that reflect details of separate incidences in order to file multiple charges. So, if they experience multiple incidences of maltreatment, children may be subjected to repeated interviews. Research has shown both negative and positive effects of repeated interviews on children's memory and suggestibility. The reminiscence effect can explain why multiple interviews might be useful, because one, they're able to relay and also think about their initial elements that they're going through and things that had happened primarily can be useful. So here's one, 14-year-old girl informed her mother that the mother's former partner had sexually assaulted her. There was evidence that the young girl was telling the truth. An interview with the girl using open-ended questions disclosed 3 separate episodes of abuse. Notice how it was open-ended, so initially you're allowing the individual to kind of share. Second interview disclosed another episode and more corroborating details. So now initially you're looking at additional information and additional charges for the perpetrator. Repeated interviewing is necessary when an alleged victim is too distressed to provide useful information initially. When victims fail to disclose abuse that is later documented by medical examination or suspect confessions, or when other new evidence comes to light. Again, sometimes repeated interviewing is needed because the individual may, at the time, may have been extremely shocked or may initially be in that fight or flight or freeze element. And so when that happens, the individual may be in initial shock. And after initial shock has worn off, the individual is now able to process their emotions, they're able to process what had happened. And so now within that, they're able to go back and also do a repeated interviewing process. So now, investigative interviewer questioning a child. Disclosing of child maltreatment. Children are sometimes reluctant to disclose abuse or experience and may even deny them when asked. A lot of times this is based upon the fact that the individual that is abusing them is sometimes a family member or is a relative. Research does suggest that many children can remember significant details of abuse experience, and if asked directly, can describe them quite accurately. So initially, a subgroup of abuse victims either forget abuse or remember it poorly. They always ask the question of why. Why does that happen? Why? And again, a lot of times it's a coping mechanism. Initially, they're looking at primarily trying to cope with the maltreatment. Initially, they'll suppress it, inhibit it, or ignore their thoughts about it. therefore weakening the initial memory. And over time, the initial experience is primarily either repressed or primarily forgotten until at a later time. Say, for example, they start going to therapy, and suddenly those initial, this would be at later times, so this would possibly be in adulthood, where suddenly they start to remember a lot of those emotions or a lot of those that prior assault or that prior abuse that initially they might have repressed. And so initially that's one of the things you're looking at. So you have abuse, neglect, household dysfunction, and primarily all those can be considered various levels of trauma, and it encodes into a child. But again, one of the things is they're trying to recode a lot of the information in a manner that allows them to cope. Although most children or most child treatment cases end in admission of guilt or plea bargains, tens of thousands of children, often preschoolers, must testify in abuse trials each year. What is the effect on the child having to discuss these issues in court? Initially, talking about victimization in public setting may increase the trauma for many children. In other words, re-victimization. And for some, it may actually be a form of therapy because they're able to process what had happened. They're able to process the initial abuse. They're able to get it out of their system primarily. And so they're able to say, yes, this had happened, and therefore they're able to release it. But again, for others, they may be in that initial phase of still trying to process the initial elements, and having to do it in front of strangers may initially exacerbate that level of trauma. So, how do jurors perceive child witnesses? And there's two different elements. In mock trials studies, child eyewitnesses are generally viewed as less credible. But in actual CSA cases, younger victims are viewed more credible than adolescents or adults, primarily from the outlook that the younger child lacks sexual knowledge to fabricate an allegation. But again, a lot of this can be influenced and also altered based upon the initial perpetrator. Say, for example, if it's a young child and they were already groomed to initially view pornography or view different elements of sexual assaults or all these different elements, and or they may have had prior sexual knowledge through the perpetrator, in which they were the information is primarily forced on them. Therefore, their knowledge becomes more broader, and therefore it may alter their ability to offer a more detailed account. Note that jurors can recognize the effects of suggestive questioning. So now, one of the biggest modifications has been the utilization of CCTV. Judges allow various courtroom modifications to protect children from the potential stress of testifying. They're utilizing, in this brief shot, they're utilizing an individual who had abused their child, and therefore they're utilizing a computer. And so, again, that's where you have the testimony kind of being proffered. So the placement of a screen in front of the defendant has been used so the child witness cannot see him or her while testifying. The Supreme Court later ruled that the defendant's right to confront his accuser was not outweighed by the necessity of protecting the victims of sexual abuse. This would be Coy v. Iowa, 1988. In the case of Maryland v. Craig, the court upheld a law permitting a child to give testimony in a different part of the courthouse and have the testimony transmitted to the CCTV. The law applied to cases where the child was likely to suffer significant emotional distress by being in the presence of the defendant. And one of the things is, if you go to adult cases in regards to domestic violence, and I'll be talking about that, I believe it's in the next chapter. We'll be looking at the elements of domestic violence and the fear factor of an abuser. But when you look at those cases, a lot of times in family court as well as the initial criminal court, they can be the same application can be applied. Therefore, you're looking at the safety of the individual in terms of the emotional distress. A lot of times the jury and the court will uphold the element that they have to face their perpetrator. But again, if the individual had been abusive to the point where the victim is now fearing for their life to the point where they're not able to function properly. Again, these are other elements that can be applied. So again, with Craig, this modified the rule of the Coy case. So now, can toddlers really represent themselves in court? Children give more detailed statements when allowed to testify on CCTV. Children also feel less nervous when allowed to testify outside of the courthouse, outside of the courtroom. One, because there's that release, that fear factor is not there. Again, the individual who's having to testify, but it's also the element of being more comfortable in terms of sharing their experiences. But again, children who testify via CCTV are viewed less positively than children who testify in open court. Again, these are jurors. It's one of those things where they look at it in terms of they're facing the perpetrator, therefore their testimony must be more accurate. So now other modifications. Provide an advocate who can familiarize the child with the courtroom setting. And this was one of the key elements that I always looked at, being a coordinator at the time, and kind of advising a lot of my victim advocates. And one of the things we're always looking at was trying to make sure that the individual was supported at all times. And at times, even just having an advocate there, it's one of those things where they're not necessarily the law, or they're not necessarily a lawyer, but the advocacy is primarily saying, yes, I'm here for you. I initially am your support system. In addition to that, that permits a support person to sit with the child during testimony. And at times, even just sitting there with the child, you're initially saying, I'm here for you, and initially offering that verbal support as well as that physical presence. At times, even the perpetrators will utilize intimidation factors, staring at the child for prolonged periods of time, if they're having to sit in an actual court system. Or even through the CCTV, you have individuals who will try to utilize, and I always talk about that when I do presentations, about the native glare. The native glare being an individual just staring at you and dogging you out. Again, you have perpetrators that would initially utilize that as a fear tactic, or just utilize different elements to try to intimidate the individual. Again, you also make structural changes to the courtroom. One of the biggest structural changes I used to always advise a lot of my advocates was to sit next to the initial victim, so long as the perpetrator would not see the initial child or the initial victim. And again, because one of the things is a lot of times the perpetrator will try to look over to try to utilize even just that intimidation factor. And so within that, that's one of the things you're looking at is change the structural changes to the courtroom, just to try to make sure that it is more feasible for the child to share their experience and share the things that they're initially fearful of. And because again, these are all adults, because they're coming before other adults. And one of the things is a lot of times you have perpetrators utilizing different tactics to try to gain sympathy. So that's one of the things is utilizing all these different factors to try to make sure that's more accommodating to a child. So now, looking at repressed and recovered memories, so looking at memory retrieval. So emotionally motivated forgetting is called repression. Initially, you're emotionally motivated to forget something. Forgotten events are thought to be so traumatizing that individuals bury them deeply in their unconscious. So initially, they're trying to repress a lot of these emotions and try to repress all these different feelings that they may have felt at that initial time or even after. You have individuals who are looking at in terms of as they're growing and growing up in an abusive household. Years later, they may have gone away or moved on in their lives, but as they think about the initial things that they've gone through, they're initially looking at it from the angle of, I should have done this, I should have done that, I should have done this more, I should have gone away quicker, I should have done this, this, and this. And so within that, that's where they start to look at it in terms of repression, simply saying, I'm going to just actively forget it. These repressed memories sometimes stay forgotten unless and until they are spontaneous recall by exposure to some aspects of the original experience. So say, for example, the smell of a certain cologne or a smell of a certain perfume, or the initial raising of a voice at a certain octave that initially reminds them of the possible abuse, or initially going down. And one of the things I kind of remember working as utilizing counseling techniques, I was working with an individual, and one of the things is this individual, they would pass by this certain location on the reservation, and whenever they drove past it, it reminded them of their childhood trauma. And so they would call at certain times, and when they were going to have to pass that, they would call me, and that's where we would kind of talk it through and everything else and try to process what's going on. Because initially, when they would pass through that location, initially that location automatically triggered initial once forgotten memory. And so that's one of the things, is sometimes that original experience or something triggers it, or something reawakens those once forgotten memories. Now, some suggest that repression has never been proven to exist, and that the inability to remember traumatic effects can be explained by ordinary forgetting. So again, you're going to have two different camps. You're going to have individuals who are looking at it from the same, from the angle of repression doesn't primarily exist. It's a possibility that they just forgot, and the aspect of utilizing therapy may simply just be the recreation of new memories, or recategorization of those initial memories that they've gone through, and it's implementation of uniqueness within their mind. But again, you're always going to have two different camps that initially come from two different angles in terms of memory recovery. Now, a related unconscious process is dissociation. In other words, the victim of abuse or the traumas are thought to escape the full impact of an experience by psychologically detaching themselves from it. In other words, dissociative identity disorder. In other words, DID. So initially, an individual may suddenly go within their own mind to escape. Say, for example, if a person is being traumatized, they may initially go into and create another alter. In other words, within their mind to initially escape the initial features of the trauma that they're initially experienced. And that's where they initially detach themselves, initially going within their own mind to protect themselves. A lot of times the child may simply say, you know what, I'm going to go on an imaginary journey so as to initially forget the fact that I'm being abused at this given moment. And this can also go into adulthood. And that's one of the things you're always looking at, is the psychological detachment. Within that, you have stigmas. Because we always ask the element of reports of repressed and recovered memories involve claims of child sexual abuse. So initially within that, the theory is that individuals, the theory is that individuals that had suffered sexual or physical abuse as children are often at the hands of trusted adults. Number two, repressed or dissociated any memory of these horrors for many years. Initially, that's primarily the element of why they initially repressed a lot of these memories. And number three, they recover their memories of the abuse when it was psychologically safe to do so. So again, this individual may simply look at it from the angle of, well, now is the time. I'm able to now share because I feel more in control of what's happening now. Versus when I was a child, there was no way to get away from the perpetrator. There was nowhere I could have gone anyway. I primarily was at the mercy of the initial perpetrator. But now I'm an adult, and now I have the capability to rationalize. And I finally have the understanding that yes, what I had gone through was initial child sexual abuse. And again, some individuals they've gone through all these different elements, and they were never given that opportunity to understand that yes, what had happened to them was an initial wrong. And so within that, now they're able to say, yes, I now am able to recover from this. I'm now able to move forward. The things that happened to me, but within that, I'm able to move forward from these repressed memories or these dissociated memories. So now moving on. So sometimes repressed memories are recovered only after a person participates in psychotherapy. This is where the utilization of hypnosis, age regression, guided visualization, diary writing, or therapist instructions to help clients remember. Many researchers and therapists question the validity of these memories that resurface years after the alleged incidents, particularly after the individual has been in therapy. So within that, sometimes even the age of, or not the age, but my mind just left me right now. But so say, for example, a lot of times, a lot of these incidences are happening after a prolonged period of time. But now for this individual, they may now feel that they are in greater control of their lives. And so within that, they're able to say, yes, this had happened, but now I'm able to move forward. And primarily that's what you're always looking at, is the resilience factor. So now, given the right creating false memories. So how do we create false memories? Given the right set of circumstances, people can create memories of incidents that never occurred. Psychologists have been able to implant false memories by, one, enlisting the help of family members, who suggest to adult research participants that these relatives recall a fabricated event. Number two, asking participants to imagine events that never occurred. And number three, doctoring family photographs. So now, merely imagining or viewing a photo associated with a fabricated event can dramatically increase the rate of false memories, even when the event is completely implausible. And the question is why? And the act of imagining may make the event seem more familiar, but that familiarity is mistakenly related to childhood memories rather than the act of imagination itself. So, creating false memories. Unfortunately, without corroboration, it's very hard to know which distant memories are true and which were implanted via suggestion. You guys remember this movie, Inception? It's one of those things where you're able to implant a memory. So again, one of the things you're always looking at is false memory in court. So again, is this possible? Yes, it is. There is a possibility of this happening. Again, accusations that arise from recovered memory sometimes result in litigation. Again, although note that at times prosecutors have decided not to pursue cases based solely on repressed memory because of the high burden for admissibility of testimony based on repressed memory. Again, a lot of prosecutors are looking at it from the angle of, is this case winnable? And am I going to ride everything on the possibility of a repressed memory? Probably not. I need more evidence. Some accusers have retracted their claims of repressed memories for abuse. Again, that is also another possibility. Some accusers have retracted their claims. Simply, some have recanted what they've said. Initially, they may say, no, this hadn't happened, or this had happened, but it happened a little differently. Again, parents have sued therapists who use memory recovery techniques to help their adult children recover supposedly repressed memories of childhood or child sexual abuse. The claims of these malpractice lawsuits usually take the following form. One, the abuse never occurred. Two, therapists created and implanted false memories of abuse through their use of memory retrieval techniques. And three, clients ultimately came to believe the false memories and accuse the alleged abuser. Again, these can happen. So what does this mean for memory? Should we believe everything you remember? Again, it's one of those things where you want to make sure that as you're proceeding in a case, you want to make sure that if you're providing expert testimony, you're primarily labeling the pitfalls. You're labeling the pitfalls of memory itself, eyewitness accounts. You're labeling the impacts of, if it's a child sexual abuse, you want to make sure that you're also labeling the impacts of accountability. And so that's one of the things you always take into account. And as I noted, one of the things is the prosecution. A lot of times they're looking at other factors. They're not just simply looking at an eyewitness account. They're looking at all these other aspects of evidence to make sure that their case does have a level of winnability. So all these different factors will go into it. So again, if you have any additional questions, you know where to find me, email. So again, that closes it for today. Other than that, we'll be moving on to chapter, I believe it's chapter, we'll be looking at I believe it was domestic violence, and looking at abuse in the next chapter. So if you have any questions, be sure to email me. Have a good day. Be awesome. Be amazing. Thank you.